we are moving on to our keynote. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Jared Genser. Jared has been an international human rights lawyer for more than 2 decades. He is Managing Director of Perseus Strategies, outside counsel to the Neurorights Foundation, and a member of the advisory board to the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights at Harvard University, where he was previously a senior tech fellow. Over his career, he has advised multilateral institutions, governments, companies, foundations, and civil organizations. He holds a BS from Cornell University, an MPP from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, where he was an alumni public service fellow, and a JD Cum Laude from the University of Michigan Law School. Today, in conversation with Alex Bedrosyan, a partner at Lewis Bob Kaufman Middlemiss, Jared will share insights from his work advocating on behalf of political prisoners worldwide, including Artsakh leader Ruben Vardanyan, the challenges and strategies involved in high-stakes international representations, and the lessons he has learned from confronting some of the world's most pressing human rights issues. Please join me in welcoming Jared Genser and our moderator, Alex Bedrosyan, and thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ani. Thank you, Armin. Mr. Genser, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you all for coming. I think since this is the Armenian Bar Association annual event, we'd love to start without prejudice to all the other work you've done, but we'd like to talk about your work defending, of course, Ruben Vardanyan. Can you please tell us the status of his case, and if you feel comfortable sharing, how is his personal demeanor, and what has he been doing to cope with this very difficult day-to-day situation?
Yeah, I think many of you obviously know Ruben, or love Ruben. So he's about as strong as they come, and it's why people like him have really inspired me to become a human rights lawyer in the first place, because there are very few people in the world that are prepared to risk their lives for the sake of their own people, their community, and their country. And we in the international community have to stand in solidarity with such extraordinary people and to help them through really the most difficult times that one can face. I don't think that when Ruben returned to Artsakh that he knew how things were going to play out, let alone that he would have spent so long as a political prisoner of Baku and of Alia. And he's doing as well as one can under the circumstances. Obviously, we saw in February the mass convictions of the Armenian Christian hostages, including Ruben and the other Artsakh leaders, which is obviously devastating for them and their families, but also I know devastating for the people of Armenia, for the Artsakh residents who were displaced in the ethnic cleansing. And so, the bottom line is that we have had obviously since August 8th of 25 this initial framework, not an agreement, not legally binding, that was overseen by President Trump. With Alia and Pashinyan in the White House, but implementation of that agreement is obviously totally uncertain. And the reality is, we also know that the release of the Armenian Christian hostages was not a part of the agreement at all in the first place. And despite President Trump's promise at the time to help Prime Minister Pashinyan secure the release of the prisoners, there hasn't been a follow-up that has led to that outcome. So what I would say is that all of them are in a very, very tough set of circumstances. And at the end of the day, we're trying to enforce international law in the context of imprisonment of political prisoners. The law is an important tool to try to achieve that end. But practically, we all knew that none of them was going to receive justice from the Baku military court, when even at the outset, it's illegal international law to try a civilian before a military tribunal. And nonetheless, one has to mobilize the law to then support political and public relations advocacy efforts to get someone out. So it's obviously very tough times in a wide array of ways. Perhaps made a little bit harder when it comes to eventually consigning, we would hope, of a peace agreement that would include at least in a parallel process, the release of all the Armenian hostages. This has been made more complicated, obviously, by the election results in Armenia. I'm not saying that as a political observation, but just simply narrowly on the human rights question of implementing this framework. Because obviously, Pashinyan's party, with a majority in the parliament and the Moscow-backed opposition, may be able to block, for example, what would need to happen, according to Aliyev, which is, of course, an amending of the Armenian constitution to remove the language on, the goal of reunification with Artsakh, with Armenia. So there's a lot of different angles we can go and ways we can get into this, but just as a first observation, that's where it's going.
Okay, I guess what would be interesting to me is, can you talk a bit about practically, I guess, what happened during his case, practical, how do you communicate with him, just some of we'd love to know a bit about a day in the life of, or many days in the life of a human rights lawyer defending a political prisoner remotely.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. We had for a long time, actually, a really courageous domestic lawyer in Baku who did a very good job as best as he could within the circumstances. There are very few lawyers in Baku that would ever touch a case like this, because the reality is, as we all know, there's a lot of prejudice among Azeris, given decades of state of Armenia and everything about Armenians and their value and all the rest. And I don't want to mention this guy's name because although his name has been mentioned before in the public, but in general I don't speak about him publicly because I don't want to get into any more trouble than he was already in. But he actually was able to serve Ruben through what was 50 different hearings over the course of many months before the Baku military court. And the hearings were honestly a sick joke, right? I mean, totally incompatible with the obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as it relates to due process rights. And obviously Ruben and all the others were being prosecuted not for the alleged crimes, ridiculously large number of alleged crimes with which they were charged, but simply because they were standing up for the autonomy and the independence of the Armenian people and the residents of Artsakh, and because they were exercising the right to freedom of political participation and their right to freedom of opinion and expression. And this is, of course, why they were all targeted. On Ruben's case particularly, it was, maybe one nice way to put it was it was a clown show. The entire proceeding was closed to the public, which obviously violates the right to have a fair and public hearing. The judiciary, of course, in military tribunal cases is not independent or impartial, even in a country where the rule of law prevails, because at the end of the day, military judges report to the commander-in-chief, and the commander-in-chief is President Aliyev. So obviously no independent impartial tribunal. And what they did, and again, I'm not even quite sure why they went through the motions of doing this, honestly, except for just buying time, because it was very, very time consuming, is that they literally paraded before the tribunal, when it came to it, about 250 to 300 quote witnesses, who were either people that were injured in some way in exchanges of fire between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or family members of those who were killed in those kinds of exchanges. And all of the evidence that was being provided was hearsay evidence, inadmissible in any court that I've ever been aware of, because literally, okay, fine. I mean, I think my overall sense of it is that these are people who were actually injured, or the family members who were injured, and because medical records were presented, we looked at the names of some of the people, we saw news reports about people being killed or injured. But when asked by our counsel, what evidence do you have that has anything at all to do with Ruben Vardanyan? Have you met him? Have you seen him? Was he present when this happened? Do you have evidence that he worked for the Armenian military? Because these were Armenian military for the most part, attacks and so forth. And obviously all of them said no, they had none of that evidence. Their evidence was they were told by the government of Armenia, Azerbaijan, that he was the one responsible for all these actions. And that was the sum total of the case that took 50 hearings to come to a conclusion. So they didn't have a lot to do. It's just, what's the point of this, right? In terms of, and obviously the summary conviction was no surprise, and the outcome was no surprise in advance. In terms of how his ability to communicate, my ability to communicate with him and so forth, he has had semi-regular calls, but only with his family. He hasn't been allowed to talk to lawyers. I actually wrote to the government of Azerbaijan to request access to him. never got a response, followed up multiple times, asked the US government to follow up, nothing, right? So you have a right to counsel under the CPR, including international counsel, and obviously those rights were being substantially violated. I mean, there were many other due process abuses. I mean, for the first 6 months, they only would provide, the information in Azeri language. You have, of course, a right to have this information translated. They had like thousands of pages of documents, but none of them of any relevance to Ruben at all. Because Ruben was being blamed as one of the key leaders behind what they considered to be a secessionist movement within their own country and so forth. And so all the evidence was about their claims about Artsakh not being legitimate and it being a breakaway republic that was in violation of their constitution and their laws and all the rest of it. But none of it was about any of the actions of Ruben himself. I mean, Ruben, as you know, was was in charge of the military when he was working with the government. He worked on the civilian side. So the reality is that the law here is an attempt by the Azeris to try to make something out of nothing. I don't think most people in the international community believe that Ruben did anything wrong. Definitely, obviously, nobody in this room. And at the end of the day, I mean, the due process abuses were so profound and so severe that obviously his detention is illegal and in violation of international law. And at the end of the day, when you're talking about these kinds of very high-profile cases, Ruben and the others, you're not going to have a solution, obviously, in a domestic legal proceeding. You need to get the political pressure applied onto Aliyev so that his least worst choice among a lot of choices is releasing him. So we're not where we should be. We're not where we need to be, and we have to keep fighting. At the end of the day, I'd say every case that I ever took on as a human rights lawyer was impossible when I began, because I take on some very hard cases that are, some of which are well known publicly, many of which are not, but nonetheless very hard. And you basically have to outmaneuver the dictator. And when they will break every law, and they will torture and imprison and break their own laws to do whatever is necessary to maintain their grip on power, we have to, as international lawyers, work within the rule of law and within the international system and do everything we can from every angle we can to make the release of the prisoners necessary. Right now, I am very concerned, as I'm sure you are as well, about where we stand with the status of this initial framework, because Trump, obviously, not just in the case of Armenia, Azerbaijan, but in I think he's claiming credit for 8 different conflicts that he's fully resolved, including the Iranian hostilities with the United States. That's been, apparently the hostilities have come to an end. I don't know. I mean, again, this isn't a political observation, but the reality is that what we really need is the president to follow through on his commitments. And he, when he was running for office, as you all know, spoke out about the Armenian genocide, spoke about, about how what took place with the displacement of the Artsakh people over the border into Azerbaijan, was something he condemned. And he said that he would stand up for persecuted Christians. So to me, there's no better opportunity to stand up for persecuted Christians than to follow through on what he said to Prime Minister Pashinyan to get Ruben and the others out, period, full stop, the end. And on the one hand, because the peace process was going to move, you would always want, as an international lawyer, to ensure that a resolution of your client's case was part of something that had to be signed, right? The flip side of it now, as this thing will drag on for some time, because I don't see Aliyev doing anything further until the Constitution is amended, irrespective of the fact that my view is that the Trump administration should have been insisting that the Armenian government should not have to amend it. But putting that aside, the reality is that because it's not part of this process, it actually could be resolved independent of the process. We don't have to wait for the conclusion of the process. So it's sort of the flip side of the same, on one hand, it's unfortunate that nothing is going to be moving anytime soon. But on the other hand, it means that they can get this resolved independently. As I'm sure you all saw, last week, there's a congressional amendment moving the House, calling for the release of the Armenian Christian hostages. Obviously, Aliyev is taking every opportunity he can to claim that this is all resolved, done, and there's nothing more to see here, right? And we saw that when, rather ironically, on the same day that he did the first set of mass convictions was the day J.D. Vance was landing in Baku in February. And then later, of course, Vance came later, but they were, when the convictions happened, it was Ali ibn Pashinyan in the UAE accepting his Peace Prize. Literally on the same day that the Armenian Christian, hostages were being given bogus and lengthy prison terms. So we have a long way to go.
So much there. We'll ask a bit about each of them. Just starting with maybe the most optimistic thing. This lawyer in Baku that is working with you, just briefly, is he court appointed, and what on earth is his motivation?
So I can't really speak as much to his motivation. I can speak a little to his motivation, but basically, he's a guy who wants to stand up for those that are being oppressed. Like me, he happens to be Jewish. I don't think that you can be raised Jewish and have a strong Jewish identity and faith as I do, and not remember from your school at a very young age learning about Adolf Hitler's comment and right before he invaded Poland in 1939, where he said, "Who remembers the annihilation of the Armenians?" And so, for me, this is one of the things that drew me to this case and to this situation. In light of that history, my own family got to the United States primarily at the turn of the 20th century, but all the family that was left behind were all murdered in the Holocaust. And when you look at the trends of history and things repeating themselves, and you see what happened, obviously, with the ethnic cleansing of the Artsakh population, past is obviously a prologue at the same time. So he happens to be Jewish. I think that that's one motivation as well that he might have. It's a very unpopular position to take in Azerbaijan, as you might imagine. He was not court appointed. We were actually able to get him. Originally, there was a court appointed lawyer that was obviously working for the government and not for Ruben. We wanted to get rid of him. We didn't have another option. A few months in, we were able to get this guy to help. And he helped up to the point at which he was then blocked from further access to Ruben. So he's no longer representing him. Ruben, as I'm sure you saw, announced he's not going to appeal his conviction, not because he agrees with it, but because obviously it's a fruitless exercise. And so there isn't really a particular role for a Serbian lawyer to play right now, except for just trying to maintain access. Obviously, we're all incredibly concerned about the ICRC having been kicked out of Azerbaijan, and the ICRC was able to do prison visits, including with Ruben. And so we were getting some information in real time from the ICRC as they were conducting their visits. But only the family has been allowed to talk to Ruben on the phone, and they're, sometimes it can go multiple months before a call, despite obviously the Azerbaijani prison regulations allowing and in fact requiring prisoners to be able to talk to their family, for example, once a week. So yeah, I think that's kind of where things stand overall. But I've never actually spoken to Ruben. I obviously tried to see him and was turned away. Can't say I'm that unhappy in this audience of not being allowed in, because I'm not sure I would be allowed out. I would have had to have relied on the U.S. Embassy advice on that one. But at the end of the day, I do go to places where I'm not welcome, although I'm very careful about where to go. But I have been barred from traveling to a number of different countries, including Venezuela and Maldives, and more recently Cambodia, where I went to observe a trial of a good friend of mine who's a human rights lawyer, who's a law school classmate of mine actually as well, named Terry Sang in Cambodia. We did a press conference after one of the days of her trial with lots of international media, and I was asked, what would I do if the case was lost? And I said, well, we'll take her case to the UN Group of Arbitrary Detention, and I described a wide array of the reasons why the charges were politically motivated, and there was a lack of due process in the case. And within about 3 or 4 hours, the government had come out with a statement accusing me of trying to illegally coerce the judiciary. I only went to Cambodia because I knew that the then dictator Hun Sen didn't have a habit of imprisoning foreign human rights lawyers or people. But anyway, I was happy to get it up laid out, but then about a week later, it was announced in the national news broadcast that I'd been barred for life from traveling to Cambodia, which is a human rights lawyer is like a dream come true. My wife was a little upset because she wanted to see Angkor Wat at some point, and I said, no, don't worry, it's not a ban on my life, it's probably going to be a ban on the dictator's life. But nonetheless, I just say that to say that obviously, Ali was not messing around. Everybody knows that. and nobody should be giving him a free pass, and people should be holding him accountable. And if not the president, then honestly, I don't know who can do it. Obviously, we're coming up in an election, and again, all my work as a human rights lawyer is totally apolitical. I work with Democrats and Republicans. Nobody really knows about or asks about my political affiliations because it's not relevant to what I do. But I would say that obviously in the run-up to the election, it's not as a political observation, but as a practical observation. You know, the evangelical Christian community is very important to the president. He needs evangelicals to turn out, and we're doing the best we can, you know, engaging with evangelical Christian groups and having them engage with the White House and with the State Department, you know, both from the Hill as well as kind of more beyond from major evangelical Christian organizations. We need to be doing more of that. You know, the reality is that getting this group out and saying he got a bunch of persecuted Christians out is very helpful for the president. And I will say about this president, and again, not a political observation, that he's cared more about getting out wrongly imprisoned Americans and political prisoners around the world than any president that I've worked with over my career, going back to when I first came to Washington in the year 2000 and George W. Bush was president. I don't know quite why that is, but he clearly cares a lot about it. And you know, he was able to get one of my clients out of jail, which of course I publicly praised him for, last December, representing Artsakh, the Nobel Peace Laureate from 2022 from Belarus, and with his envoy, John Cole, they were able to get 200 political prisoners out of prison, and most of them out of the country in Belarus, including Artsakh, all on the same day. So there are upsides and downsides that one would look at in terms of the way that the president conducts his foreign policy. But you know, when he's making nice with dictators and proclaiming, you know, peace agreements and all of his success, you know, what I think we all need to be doing now is to say you can't actually consider what you've done on Armenia and Azerbaijan a success until number one, the people that they are, you know, the people that were the leaders of Artsakh are released or returned to Armenia. This is something that pulls at the heartstrings of and you know, very much something that the Armenian people want to see, not just, you know, in Armenia but around the world, to see them freed. And of course, you have to go beyond an initial framework to an actual agreement and to a permanent peace, you know, which is undertaken in a way that is just for both sides in light of the history. So I think that that's, you know, from a messaging standpoint, you know, if we can get a lot of the evangelical Christian groups, and we can get Democrats and Republicans on the Hill and others saying, you know, Mr. President, getting out the Armenian Christian leaders is, you know, the, you know, is in essence basically the canary in the coal mine, right? If you don't resolve that, then you haven't, you know, there's no hope really of getting to a sustainable peace, because you can't have a sustainable peace without justice and without accountability. And you know, the Armenian Christian prisoners, you know, need the help that you promised you'd provide.
Speaking of messaging, what if, as we're doing this, let me take the devil's advocate point of view. You mentioned
Just be the devil.
Okay. But I don't think they're missing much not going to Baku, but Azerbaijan.
I've been to Baku before, actually, representing another Azeri political prisoner who remains in prison there, unfortunately, as well. But it's a beautiful place for what it's worth, and that oil money is they put it a lot there. So Baku itself, if you didn't know any better, looks like any wonderful Western city. But yeah, I mean, representing a Azeri political prisoner is quite different than representing Ruben, Vardanyan, obviously.
So as because we have a lot of government or government adjacent lawyers here, as we're trying to do the messaging, what if someone tells us, look, Ruben did lead a secessionist entity that was clearly a threat to Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and clearly illegal under Azerbaijani law. So clearly there's something to prosecute him with under domestic law. Azerbaijan can detain him and prosecute him. What's a two-sentence rebuttal we could give to that?
Sure. Well, you know, Azerbaijan on its own voluntarily signed and ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They read among the first articles of that covenant that says that when you sign and ratify the treaty, which again, Azerbaijan didn't have to sign and ratify, but they did, it says you must bring your domestic law into compliance with the requirements of the treaty. And the treaty itself requires you're protecting freedom of opinion expression, freedom of political participation, freedom of peaceful assembly, and so forth. And it also includes the right of self-determination of peoples. So, at the end of the day, every dictatorship in the world that prosecutes somebody says it's a violation of our own law. We don't live in a world where domestic law reigns. We're not in the 1800s pre-international law, which was being discussed in, but was of no consequence. It was just power politics globally and might is right, right? And we're in the 21st century where law actually matters, and when you sign and ratify an agreement, you have to abide by it. So it doesn't matter if in their own minds that they believe that he can be prosecuted. Even when I look at, for example, the Security Council resolutions on Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, they're intentionally unclear, right? And they say that the status of the territory needs to be resolved through negotiation. So they can say that it was a violation of their own laws, but the Security Council itself didn't say that Artsakh belongs to Azerbaijan. If they'd said that, they'd have a stronger argument. But what it said is that this is contested territory that requires a resolution through peaceful processes. It's the reason the whole Minsk group was set up, obviously, after the Security Council resolutions. And yes, it's been dissolved, and yes, Aliyev is claiming that means that there's nothing to see here and there's nothing wrong. But none of that actually changes the fact that Azerbaijan signed and ratified the ICCPR, and that the Security Council resolutions, which were legally binding on all states, made clear that this remained until otherwise spoken by the Security Council as contested territory that had to be resolved through negotiation. I'd also just note lastly that all the due process abuses, irrespective of what they were charged with, and even if the Azeri government wanted to say, well, they did all these crimes under law, they violated their own constitution and their own laws extensively, not just the ICCPR, in terms of the entire way that the trial was held. So even if you would believe an argument from Baku that, well, they're secessionists, et cetera, right? As we all know as lawyers, it isn't enough that a person is proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt to be not guilty of a criminal charge, but they also must have been afforded all of their due process rights under the constitutional laws of the country and international law. And if there have been a sufficient range of violations of due process rights, that even that a conviction would be invalid, right? Even if substantively you might have proven your case, when you're in military court where civilians can't be tried and where you have all the other characteristics that describe the trial, to me there's it's very clear how it turned out. So yeah, that wasn't quite 2 sentences, but we're all lawyers here, so I hope you forgive me.
Yeah, and I'll add another sentence to that. I mean, this point about the UN Security Council resolution is so powerful. Those of you who've been following the conflict for many years, I mean, that was Azerbaijan's main trump card, that the Security Council resolutions say our territory is occupied, et cetera, et cetera. But as Mr. Genser just very shrewdly, as Jared very shrewdly just said, those resolutions also said that one side can't impose by force a solution to the conflict and that the territory remains disputed. So I didn't hear that point being made by the Nagorno-Karabakh advocates.
I don't know why they had. To me,
yeah.
I would have hung my hat on a binding Chapter 7 resolution of the UN Security Council, which every member of the UN is legally bound when the Security Council operates under a Chapter 7 authority to abide fully by those kinds of judgments. And no country in the world should be able to take the side of Azerbaijan on it because it would be violating their own obligations under the UN Charter.
That's a great point. Before we go to audience questions, how are we doing on time?
Great.
Okay. You mentioned a few times before getting to your other cases, one other thing on this. As you've written, legal tools are rarely enough on their own to achieve a human rights policy outcome. You need to combine them with PR and political leverage and ultimately raise the cost for the dictator to hold these people. So in the case of Aliyev, under what scenario would it be more costly for him to keep holding on to these prisoners than to release them? And what could we all, as the interested stakeholders, do to raise those costs for him?
So I mean, there are lots of things that can be done, and when you're working as a human rights lawyer, international human rights lawyer, as I am, I mean, you basically look at any given moment in a case, as you refine your strategy, what are the 50 things I can do to help a person, legal, political, public relations, and like what's the most direct route, and then you go to indirect routes. mean, undoubtedly the most direct route, but so far he hasn't been willing to follow through, is President Trump. Because if President Trump finally gets pushed enough by evangelical Christian leaders and others, conservative talk radio, and you name it, that like he needs to help these persecuted Christians, you know, I think he would have the ability to tell Aliyah this just has to get resolved. Because Aliyah is getting a lot of things from the president that he wants. And the reality is that, you know, and I've been making this point obviously to senior officials of the White House and the State Department as well. In certain respects, I think, you know, although I don't generally do this publicly, but I think Aliyah is making a fool out of Trump in a lot of ways. And President Trump is a guy who likes to be made a fool of. And the reality is that unlike, you know, unlike ordinary presidents where there's like a regular order you can expect and where there are processes that need to be undertaken and so forth, President Trump is obviously totally non-traditional in his approach. You know, the irony is that I have a very good and positive working relationship with the Trump administration, with the White House and State Department. One of the things I enjoy about working with the Trump administration is that I can get to people who can get to the president. You know, and at the end of the day, it's much harder to do if there's regular order. I mean, you know, to give you an example of it, like in my first year during the Trump administration, I probably had like 10 meetings at the White House on different topics. And, you know, in the last year of the Biden administration, I had like one meeting. And because it's like if you wanted the president to do anything on a political prisoner case, you'd have to rise to that level. And then you had to, you know, exhaust your remedies in the State Department. And then you would go to the White House, and the White House would have a committee of 10 people that would have to sit in the room and decide whether to do anything or not. And that would take months and months and months. If you can get to the president, and all of us should be thinking about ways to get to the president, then it's different. I mean, one of the things that all of you can do, any of you who are Republicans or Republican supporters, is like, you know, and I wouldn't at all discount this kind of diplomacy. Any Armenian American who goes to a fundraiser for President Trump where he shows up and is in a rope line, for example, they need to say, Mr. President, I was so glad you promised to get the Armenian Christian prisoners, Pashinyan. You know, when are you going to get them out? It's urgent. You know, they're suffering enormously. And I mean, seriously, like, I mean, if you have 15, 20 people in a rope line all saying that to the president directly, the president is going to pay attention because he likes to be liked, because it's advocating on an issue that he knows is an issue that is good for his base, right? Because he's obviously self-interested. All presidents are. You know, these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about doing that have nothing to do with the law, you know, or even political advocacy in a more ordinary sense. So the answer is, I think Trump needs to be the focus and getting as many people as possible around him and to him, creating the echo chamber, evangelical Christians, conservative radio, about how this is like a really important deliverable for the upcoming elections, and looking at obviously the largest, you know, Armenian diaspora groups in Armenian American diaspora groups in the U.S. and wherever they are, you know, using being able to communicate with, like, you know, the national RNC teams there about, you know, where we support the president, for those of you, you know, and we really needed to follow through on that commitment. There are obviously a lot of indirect routes that are much harder and take more time. And the reality is right now, because of the relationship between Trump and Aliyev, I don't think we're going to get a better bilateral relationship. So I think that that's what we need to pivot to, but contrary to one's belief, because from a distance you wouldn't have any idea of what I've just described. It isn't the president and his administration are doing nothing at all, or are telling Aliyev this is totally fun. You know, by contrast, actually, they've been doing a lot of primarily backroom diplomacy. We've also had a series of people that I can't name publicly, but at least 3 people that are close to Aliyev, who met with Aliyev and said, this is a political problem for you, you should fix it. And you know, we are looking really for every channel that we possibly can, you know, to keep the pressure on. But there's going to be no better path than the president. I mean, one of the other things, of course, that hasn't been resolved at all, and obviously it's made more complicated, of course, by the agreement or the initial framework, you know, requiring the withdrawal of cases before international courts, is the reality is that initial agreement, by the way, would only be retrospective to at the time that it was signed. But you know, we've been pushing France and other countries as well, and I know many of you have been also, to see if we can get a group of member states of the Rome Statute to refer, you know, in a state referral to the ICC, despite it being under the prosecutor being under enormous fire and currently suspended. You know, an an urgent demand for them to open up a case into, the crimes against humanity that were and genocide that was committed, by the ethnic cleansing. And my own view is, the more pressure that we put on Aliyev, because this is a guy who actually does care about his public reputation, the better. I mean, as bad as things are for the Armenian Christian prisoners right now, because of my experience working against about 25 countries in my career, I've gone up against much harder dictatorships than Aliyev. If you're going up against China today, China isn't going to respond publicly to anything you do ever, right? Aliyev responds, attacks, etc. The Chinese government doesn't care. I mean, and Xi Jinping doesn't care about his so-called reputation. But Aliyev is a striver. He has an ego. He wants to be viewed as a leader in the region and in the world. And anything that we can be doing to increase the focus on the Armenian Christian prisoners in a way that starts to damage him, where much like I was just talking about with Trump and getting in rope lines and talking to Trump, we need Aliyev everywhere he goes to be asked over and over and over again by people that he has to deal with, what about the Armenian Christian prisoners? It's sort of a play off of Hitler's what about the Armenians? So I think that at the end of the day, I mean, I like to say in my work that failure is often a stop on multiple occasions on the road to success. And where there is life, there is hope, and there is undoubtedly hope here. But we have to make our own luck. We can't rely on anyone to help us. Obviously, the Armenian Bar Association does that better than anybody. So I'm not exactly saying anything that is remotely surprising. But as a human rights lawyer more generally, that's very much the way that I think about things. The next door that shuts, you need to find the window to get in, or the next house to go to, or whatever it is, the next door to knock on. We just have to keep fighting and fighting and fighting, because we can't live in a world where these prisoners live the rest of their lives in jail for simply having stood up for the self-determination of the people of Artsakh, and are subjected to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, if not torture. We cannot live in that world, and we, as humans, need to be the ones to stand up and to say enough, and to demand their release, and to demand our political leaders stand up for them, and put the pressure on Aliyev to let him out. At the end of the day, Aliyev is a human like everybody else. What Aliyev cares the most about is maintaining his grip on power. But because he has an ego, because he cares about his reputation, it means that the things that we're doing, even when he doesn't say something, are things that actually bother him a lot. And when you know that a dictator is bothered a lot by something, which is in his case, I think, his ego and his reputation, the more that you can look at that exact spot and keep hitting it and hitting it and hitting it, the better the likelihood over time that you'll succeed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Before opening up to the audience, do you want to share any lessons or anecdotes, not fun anecdotes, but interesting anecdotes from your other work? Because your other work has informed your representation of Ruben, but you're also more than your representation of Ruben, so we'd love to know.
Well, I'll tell a very quick story about another pair of cases of mine, all in the same country of Nicaragua, to perhaps maybe give you some hope. Some further hope. We all, and obviously, of course, I should note, especially given the discussions already of the Armenian Church, that we both pray and we act. We don't just act. I was representing two of the presidential candidates in Nicaragua. This is about 4 years ago now. Felix Mardiaga and Juan Sebastian Chamorro, the dictator in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega. Obviously, it's been around for a long time, and had been successful over many years at actually winning elections by dividing the opposition. And with a divided opposition, he would get a plurality of the vote and win, and he was actually winning elections. And what happened in the elections a number of years ago, as they were coming up for the presidential elections, for the first time, all of the opposition parties came together and said, we're going to have a primary among all the opposition parties to put forward one candidate. He knew he would lose that election, and he was very afraid of it, and he literally imprisoned or put under house arrest all 10 of the opposition candidates. 2 other opposition candidates fled abroad. And I was representing the candidates that I think were ranked like first and third in their popularity, working with their wives who had already been in the United States with their kids safely. It was tough work because most of the political prisoners in Nicaragua at the time, there were more than 200 of them, their families were all in Nicaragua, and there was really nobody globally traveling and advocating for the prisoners. And so on behalf of these 2 candidates, we advocated all around the world, did a lot of different things. We my clients' wives, they testified before the Organization of American States and at the Human Rights Council, and we won their cases at the UN Worker Arbitrary Detention. And we got congressional resolutions, and we did a very, very wide array of different things to put pressure on Ortega. And anyway, Ortega stole the election, and not surprisingly, and kept these prisoners all in jail, including my clients. And then when he was giving his inaugural speech for his new term in office, he said something as a throwaway line, which then became the building blocks to do something important, which was, he said in his inaugural speech, for all those criminals and all those people who stand against me that I put in jail, they're not even Nicaraguan. They should leave our country and have nothing to do with us. And so I was literally the same day on the phone with the State Department and the White House saying, you may not have noticed, most people in the US wouldn't focus on a Spanish language inaugural address of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, but take a look at this line. And what we learned later in the coming months was that actually Ortega wanted a better relationship with the Biden administration. And he sent his son as an envoy to start to engage with White House officials. And behind the scenes, as we were doing our public advocacy, which wasn't yielding, it was yielding more pressure in Nicaragua. We were able to, for example, successfully advocate for the creation of a Nicaragua Commission of Inquiry in the UN Human Rights Council and other things that Ortega was unhappy about. But behind the scenes, he wanted a different way forward. And I literally, sometimes when you're working on these cases, you sort of see tea leaves from lots of different directions coming together in the right way, and I began to feel that way. And about 2 months before what I described happened, I actually publicly said, I feel like we're getting to a breaking point with Ortega here, and I think that something big could happen. That's not to say that I could have just as easily been wrong about that. It's nice when I happen to be right. But what happened was I got a phone call literally, from the top person at USAID covering Latin America very early one morning in February, it's 3 years ago now, so it would have been, I think February 24. And the call told me that I wanted to let you know that your clients and 220 other political prisoners are on a plane to the United States right now. And I, was blown away, as you can imagine. It was one heck of an operation that they pulled off. And was there at Dulles Airport when my 2 clients arrived, along with the 220 others. And it was like nothing I had ever experienced in my career. I then had the real privilege of both my clients had gotten there, but the wives lived in different places and their kids, and so it took them longer to get to DC than the plane arriving, which was like literally landing 2 or 3 hours after I got the phone call. And so I was able to drive Felix Mardiaga back to Dulles Airport. We were at a hotel nearby where all these people were being processed and helped by the US government, and literally watched right in front of my own eyes him being reunited with his wife and 9-year-old daughter. And with his daughter crying, Daddy, I can't believe it's you, is this really happening? And it's like one of the things that one lives your life and career for as a human rights lawyer. So the situation was impossible, it continued to seem impossible, and you just gotta keep doing the work. Azerbaijan, I forgot, tough day this morning, need some more dessert with some more sugar. Azerbaijan is not China. It is not North Korea, it is not Iran, right? It is engaged in the world in a much more serious way, and we can achieve that outcome for the Armenian Christian hostages when it's been done in similar circumstances. And frankly, for President Trump, he got 200 political prisoners out of Belarus, which had not released more than a handful of political prisoners at a time, and there's still another 1,000 others. But the impact that had on those 200 people and their families, the release of my client, Azerbaijan, who's now campaigning around the world for the release of the others, was gigantic and world moving in a wide array of ways. So what I would say is that if you can get 222 political prisoners out of Nicaragua on a single plane, we can do the same for a much smaller group of people that are just as important as both the known and unknown political prisoners. We just have to keep at it. We just have to keep fighting.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much.
More dessert. I already had one, I probably shouldn't go for number 2.
Go for
No,
it.
you
Go
definitely
for it.
deserve it. Anyway, so thank you all. We're a tiny bit over time, but if we could do maybe 1 or 2 questions, if that's all right. And I'll just hand the mic to the audience. Okay, so I saw Levon and Sarah's hands go up first, so that's who's going to.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Genser. A question for you,
Jared. Everyone, my name is Jared.
Especially in the situation with Ruben, where you mentioned you weren't able to directly interface with him. How and knowing that you're targeting sort of the pressure points of the dictators you're up against, how do you sort of balance your concerns about the well-being of your client and then possible retribution against your client with sort of supporting your client's aims and goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a critical question, and one always has to have that discussion with a client, if you can, or at least their families. I will say in my career, I mean, I've done 50 cases and have gotten about 350 people out because I had a few cases with a large number of people in it over the course of my career, and it's only been a handful of times where there's actually been retribution. It doesn't happen very frequently, and because it ends up then blowing up in the face of the dictator, right? I mean, Ruben went on hunger strike, and then they put him in a punishment cell. And then, he was being denied water and other things, and it didn't go well for all of you. So at the end of the day, as I say to all my clients, while I am an expert on free political prisoners, I'm not necessarily an expert on this particular country. And more importantly, I'm not an expert on what your loved one who's in prison wants or what you want. So all I can do is give you the best advice that I can. But you make all the decisions, right? You decide how much risk you believe you're comfortable taking. I'll give you my best appraisal of the risks, the pros and the cons. But at the end of the day, the family has to decide, and Ruben has been clear from the very beginning with his family, I don't want to get out by myself. I want all of the Armenian Christian prisoners out and all of them out at the same time and do everything you possibly can to make that happen as quickly as possible. So with that kind of unambiguous instruction from my client coming through his family, as a lawyer, it's pretty easy to go full speed ahead. Obviously when you think about going after a dictator, there's certain kinds of things that are more or less provocative. Right, and Ruben himself got into trouble, although it was one of the things that he was convicted on. Although to me, it was simply an accurate statement and not a threat. But one of the things that Ruben, as you may know, has said was that Ali has to be careful if he doesn't handle things the right way, and he referred to some prior Azeri leaders who had been taken out in Europe, post-Armenian genocide because of their involvement and so forth. But for the most part, as a lawyer, I speak really in the way lawyers often do, and then of course as much as possible in human terms about the family and what they're going through and everything else. So I think that it's a really important point to always keep in mind. And at the end of the day, really, I'm guided entirely by the families as to, and the client most especially as to what to do.
Hi, Sarah Lee Winston. First of all, thank you for your work on behalf of Ruben. He's a friend of mine and a friend to many of us here, and it's very gratifying to know that we have you working on his behalf. As an international human rights lawyer myself, I wanted to probe you a little bit based on your decades of work on the moral hazards of being a human rights lawyer in the United States when, as you mentioned, your advocacy relies so much on persuading President Trump to advocate on behalf of political prisoners on grounds of international law when President Trump himself is responsible for holding political prisoners here in the United States. I don't think it's a matter of dictatorship versus not dictatorship, where President Trump is responsible for attacking the International Criminal Court, sanctioning the prosecutor, the judges, the special rapporteur, and of course has openly, along with the Secretary of War, expressed complete contempt and ridicule of international law. Law is what I say is
But other than that, you're a big fan of the president.
Sorry?
Other than that, you're a big fan of the president.
Well, I mean, it's,
I get you loud and clear, of course.
yeah, so I mean, the moral hazard of seeking the support of a dictatorial president responsible for grave human rights abuses to champion political prisoners somewhere else. And I feel like it's created a dynamic of favored victims versus disfavored victims? And as a human rights lawyer, how do you navigate that?
It may be less hard than you would think. Obviously, I hear you loud here, and obviously all your points and all the concerns about the president's behavior, undoubtedly, and I share such concerns. As a lawyer, we all have our fiduciary obligations to our clients, and that is paramount, and that trumps, you might say, everything. And as a result, I have an obligation to my client, as you know, as a human rights lawyer, and all of you in the room knows lawyers, to do everything possible within the bounds of the law to help my client. And if it requires me talking to people that I don't like, even if it requires me talking to the dictatorship representatives themselves, I'm going to go talk to everybody, pound on every door, and do everything I can to get my client out of jail. I agree with you that, but I will note that it's the same for any administration, Democrat or Republican, that there are certain kinds of political prisoners that Trump wants to help, others that he does not. And there are certain kinds of country situations where he wants to be involved and others that he does not. And so, there's, in this particular case of, and in light of the role that Trump has played, hosting the initial framework and following this very closely, he is the really most important point of contact. I have a number of political prisoner cases that don't have that strong tie to the U.S., and I work lots of other angles, multilaterally and so forth, and not the president in the White House. But at the end of the day, if there's a reason why the president should care, and I can try to get the president's ear on something, and I don't have any qualms about doing that because of my duty to my client. And the bottom line is that, I guess the saying goes, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And so at the end of the day, I just have to do what I have to do to get them out as fast as possible. And obviously that doesn't mean that I'm gonna compromise on my principles or do things or say things that they are demanding I say that I would not be comfortable saying and so forth. By the way, they've never made any demands on me in any of my cases to do anything at all. But the reason why I have a good relationship with them is because I'm bringing them only the cases that I think they might actually want to help on. And there's a logic behind it. And cases that they wouldn't want to help on, I don't bother bringing to them because that would be pointless and it would burn my political capital. So what I would say is that my conscience is clear in terms of asking Trump to help get the Armenian Christian hostages out. That's not to say that I, in any way, that's in no way a judgment on all the other things that you were just mentioning that are of enormous concern and that need to be addressed and resolved and so forth. But that my client isn't the prosecutor of the ICC. My client isn't any of the Americans detained in essence for exercising the freedom of opinion and expression. If those were my clients, they'd be acting very differently and have a very different posture and a very different way of dealing with the Trump administration, which would be through lawyers only, right? And through a legal process only and so forth. But here, because I'm an international human rights lawyer, I don't work in the U.S. except very narrow ways, but it intersects with international law. So, like for example, I'm helping. I'm counsel in a case in the U.S. District Court in D.C., representing two of my former pro bono clients, Simak and Bakhtar Namazi, who are American hostages in Iran, and we're suing under the sovereign immunity exception for state-sponsored terror for their, they're having been held as hostages for many years and so forth. But in general, I'm in some sense lucky, I guess, because of the career that I chose, that because I don't litigate things domestically and I don't work on domestic human rights issues, as a general matter, there aren't things that I'm doing that would necessarily have to rub up against the Trump administration or any other administration. So all I can do is just keep my head down and focus on my clients. And in this case, because the instruction was not to just get him out, but get them all out, I'm focusing on getting them all out, not just him, using this case as an example. That's about the best I can do.